Well, I think it's already 3:05, so I think we should get a move on. As you can see, we're just waiting for one other panelist, but we can't wait forever. So let the show begin, so to speak. Well, you know what the topic is, and actually, it's quite feel quite surprised and optimistic, actually, because normally in a conference, a second day after lunch, it's kind of like less people. Well, we're pretty full, so I think that is rather encouraging. And we're going to talk about, as you can see, inside the propaganda war, channeling influence. But I'm not 100% sure what that means. Does that mean that we should channel their influence into the dustbin, or channel our influence into other people's consciousness, or perhaps both? I'm not sure. Officially, it says, what is the antidote to disinformation and manipulation, and how should liberal democracies cope? In general terms, and having listened to sort of the discussions here, obviously, but in the, over the last few months and the last year or so, we kind of know what the problem is. But I would just like to kind of emphasize that there's two parts to this problem, and one part of the problem is that as a journalist, obviously as a Western journalist covering the war in Ukraine, I was just shocked by the level of confusion and basically what we say in English is a word called gobbledygook, which is just kind of garbage. The amount of garbage that people manage to absorb and manage to believe in Ukraine at the beginning of the war. I remember at one point talking to the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic Press Center, who told me that she said, somehow we began to talk about history, and she told me that Stalin's Gulag was, she said, a kind of fairy tale, like, Thumbelina, is what she told me. And she also told me that the Holodomor, the famine of the 1930s, was the invention of Ukrainian fascist exiles. Well, of course, to this audience, perhaps you're kind of familiar with this, but the way it kind of filtered down, the way it distorted what people thought, and the way it made people act as well, was obviously extremely powerful. So the question is, obviously one of the questions is, what are we going to do about this? But it's not only what are we going to do about it when it is directed, when this kind of gobbledygook is targeted at directly the people concerned, for example, in this case, in eastern Ukraine, but in terms of what people believe in our own societies, and not just ordinary people who don't really know one thing or another. I mean, I think it was Julian Lindley French who said, in terms of public opinion, he was talking about defense this morning, but he says public opinion knows squat about this. We need leaders to lead. But what happens if you have leaders or potential leaders, and of course I'm thinking now in Britain of Mr. Corbyn, the new head of the Labour Party, and his strategic director, his director of strategy, who also believe some of these things and have made that quite clear. What are we going to do if those are the type of people who are coming to power? I mean, unfortunately, what it reminds me of, what it made me think of, is that some of you may know that my background as a journalist was in the Balkans, an area which I still cover for The Economist. But I remember very clearly the great Serbian journalist Milos Vasic in 1991, 1992, who, when people would come to him, or journalists like me would come to him and say, it's just, I don't understand, how could all these people be turned against each other? How can they believe all this garbage? And he goes, it's like if the whole of the mainstream media in the US was taken over by the Ku Klux Klan, after 6 months, everybody in the US would go crazy as well. And what's so ultimately depressing is that today, 25 years later, with so many more means of communication rather than just the sort of TV mainstream news and a few newspapers and radio, things are not better because there's more sources of information, but just infinitely worse because there's more ways to channel gobbledygook into people's heads and channel conspiracy theories into people's heads. Okay, so I think that's probably enough from me. I will have to say a few things in a bit, but I'm going to turn first to Yanis Saltz. He's the director of the NATO Strategic Communications Center of excellence. I'm going to ask you, first of all, to tell us a little bit about what you do, but I'm actually going to be a little bit provocative. I'm going to quote you something I've kind of warned you about already. A great friend of the Baltic states is my colleague at The Economist, Edward Lucas, who wrote an article in The Times yesterday, where he mentions your centre, and to which he says, these efforts are piecemeal and to some extent useless. Broadcasting more radio and TV news about Western society to Russia is a waste of money. In the Soviet era, people despised their leaders, loathed their political and economic system, and revered the West. They would risk arrest to tune into the BBC. Now the climate of opinion has changed. Russians may not believe all the regime's anti-Western propaganda, but many regard Western news as no more truthful. And then I'm going to sort of skip a little bit. Here's the biggest problem is the way our society is run. We believe in categories and rules. Journalists guard their independence. Officials guard their secrets. Businesses want to get on with making money. But we face a joined-up threat. Russia's information warriors are part of a much bigger power projection system, from social media trolls to the intelligence services, including energy companies, banks, and the military. We do not have a joined-up response to this joined-up threat. Until we do, Russian information warfare will continue to corrode our alliances, poison public opinion, and distract our decision makers with fateful consequences for our security. Is that unfair? Is Ed Lucas being unfair to you?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the quote. I think the first thing is the success that just after 1 year of functioning, we've been noticed and we've been sort of referred to as the instrument by the Times. So I think in 1 year it's quite a considerable leap from nothing to being pointed out as the answer. I think the point here is you would not expect to remedy things within this problem by one actor in 1 year. It is much more broader phenomenon that we've been facing that is relevant to the societies we have, the way we understand information, the way journalists are actually working on the information. And of course the phenomenon is rather sort of generic, and in my view, a number of our opponents have looked at it as the weakness. In a way, as it was referred in the previous section, well, we have economic muscle, we have military muscle. So if you are opposing us, what are the tools that you are going to use to disbalance us? And what I think they're picking up is our political processes. These are our interactions, government, society. And of course, in the democratic societies, we have to create consensuses. We have to bring the societies with us. We have to have society to support the policy. And well, apart from all the information warfare, it not been the most successful of things that we as a government in Europe have been able to do. So if you have somebody deliberately pick up on it, and not on it only, and use all kinds of dirty tricks to actually go further than just pure dissemination of information, but actually make an influence operations, and all of that comes with that. And then you say, well, you produce one Center of Excellence for Strategic Communication and it'll deal with and successful with all of that. I don't think it is something that you could expect of us. What can you expect is actually which is a first element to be prepared to counter, is the knowledge. We are not actually the communicators. The way the Center of Excellence is constructed, we actually try to find out what is happening, what are the methodology that is being used, what is the successful methodology of all the actors. And Russia, I will name you, is not the only one. ISIS is actually very good at the information space and leveraging on their success in the information space. So knowledge, based on knowledge, developing the methodologies, how do you counter it? Then training, I would say first and foremost our strategic leadership of the actual concept, because for instance, in my 2 months since I'm in this director's post, I've come across people having very different interpretations of what is actually strategic communication. And I'll probably sort of, not to have everybody here having a different perception, give mine so that you understand from where I come from. And my understanding is that it's a sort of approach that everything that you say or you don't say, do, don't do, show or don't show, has an impact on information environment, thus influences people, social groups, and societies. And of course, when you, and it's a fact, the problem is we're not using this or sort of as a coherent strategy. We've looked at it as a pieces of it. The other difference is, of course, with the strategic communication, and of course my file on what Russians have been writing about our center is that thick. And you know, we've been right away been labeled as a propaganda. We're not propaganda. Propaganda is not limited in the moral boundaries. Strategic communication basic element is we have to reach credibility with our audiences. And if you want to reach credibility, you have to stick to the truth. Of course, when you look at the way Russia addresses it, they're actually attacking the premise that there is a truth as such. And if you would interpret them, let's say, I would think it would look like this. We lie, they lie, everybody lies. So you rather believe our lie than their lie. And that's a basic difference. We believe there is a truth and we stick to it. And the other thing is we look for accountability. So we, within this strategic communication approach, we are accountable for what we do. We don't say, well, one moment one thing, the other moment is the second thing, in the third moment the third thing. So there is a basic difference. And although, of course, as I've said, Russians are trying to equate these kind of two things. The other thing that I think I have to say also, which is important, the understanding and training of the journalists and the people that promote further the information in the social media. For instance, a very clear trick that has been used repeatedly and been actually very successful at the Russian authorities, let's put it that way, at actually going for the instinct for the second opinion, or the training. Our journalists are expected, when they put up a story, to ask for the second opinion. Yeah. So what they do is actually they create a story to look like a second opinion. It's nothing clear to being second opinion, but in a traditional media, they're by now out of money, out of time. If somebody brings a good prepared story, they take it. Not actually looking through the actual what is behind it. And there are countless methodologies that have been used to get at us. But of course, we are only the third audience for them. By far the most important audience, in my view, for Russia is their own public. Because that's the core of their effort, that's their main audience and their main precious audience. Then the near abroad, and then the global. So I would say we also have to look in the way in their priority system. The West is only third. It's always will be back to the way it resonates with their own audiences.
Okay, thank you. A couple of things. I forgot to say that, I forgot to remind everyone that this is being streamed live, and that if you'd like to join in the conversation, the Twitter conversation, don't forget the hashtag is RigaConf, RIGACONF, obviously. I can see some of the tweets down there. I think I'm supposed to see them here, but I'm not seeing any, so I don't know if that's because it's not working or because no one's tweeting, but if not, then please do. But just tell me, like, I said every day, what do you actually do in the centre? Just tell me, just define that. What do you do every day in the centre?
I think...
Okay.
Well, and I'll encourage everybody
Okay.
to think that's, I think, the thing that would actually help us confront the realities of information warfare. Actually, what we do research of what is happening in the information space. We take a look at, for instance, Russia methodologies. We take a look at ISIS. We take a look at lessons learned from ISAF. We look at the weaponization of social media. We do training. We help out NATO to do the strategic communication piece in their exercises. We look also from the operational perspective what is currently happening and try to interpret that in the strategic terms. What kind of intent is behind this?
Okay, thank you very much. I think, well, everyone's going to have a little bit more time because unfortunately I see that the chair has been removed, so I hope... But I hope that Galina is all right. I hope there isn't a serious problem. I'm going to turn to you now, Galinda Niehaus. You began your career as a journalist, and you went to the European Commission, and you've been working since 1999 for NATO, and are now head of the engagements section. So I might as well ask you the same question. What is the engagement section, and what does it do?
Thank you, and very pleased to be with you. Well, in a nutshell, what we are doing is outreach and cooperation with partners, interlocutors in both NATO nations, in all of them, and with all partner nations. So some 40 or so partner nations, clearly with varying degrees. So, and in that we are developing our own narrative, explaining NATO to these audiences, but we are incrementally also working with a number of notably partner nations to help them become better in communications, and that in particular also entails to work then with public bodies, government institutions. So that's in a nutshell what we are doing, and offices in Ukraine and in Moscow are piece and parcel of the operation.
And it's still functioning in Moscow?
In Moscow, yes, but as you can guess, under very difficult circumstances. I mean, the clampdown on the civil society, on media freedom, on the virtual annihilation of NGOs has an impact. But we still bring, believe it or not, we still bring Russian journalists to also to Brussels headquarters, to NATO headquarters. We bring individual groups to NATO headquarters. So my colleague Robert Pshel, whom many of you may know, is regularly in the Russian media, including in TV shows, where he's sometimes heavily sort of attacked from the Russian side in their own way of doing it. So the office is still up and running. But admittedly in a very difficult environment. But we think it's important to maintain it because one of NATO's sort of political lines vis-à-vis Russia is that we want to keep the channels of communications open. And clearly an information office is by definition that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Karen,
but thank you. But if I may, from the NATO perspective, a few points on the topic of our panel discussion. 3 points in many ways, because I'm very mindful of this sort of criticism from George Bernard Shaw. The biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So I will try to be concise. First and foremost, my first point, I think it's important to underline that from NATO, we are not really inside, or for that matter, part of a propaganda war. We are not, and we don't want to. We are not in a situation of tit for tat. So we do not want to wage information warfare or propaganda warfare, for that matter, since we consider this would be grist to the mills of the radicals around us, be they in the east or in the south. But it would also fundamentally really undermine the credibility and strength of what we are doing, because they are the sort of really the foundations of our work. So our approach, if you wish, and very briefly to map it out, is along the following lines. First and foremost, I think it's important to say that we have to stay true to our values and principles. I mean, we are democratic nations in a democratic alliance, so whatever we do also on the communication front needs to be accurate and truthful, and what we say needs to be accountable and responsive. So that's one primary goal. We also need to be united. I mean, it's easy said in an alliance at 28, but is a challenge in its own right to retain the solidarity and the unity of the alliance and a cohesive narrative around it. So, and at best, not only within NATO, but an alliance broader than that with the European Union and other international stakeholders. And in that, we then also have to develop a narrative which encapsulates our vision of life and our, if you wish, alternative to the radical versions which are to be seen in the East and the South. We also need to be careful that we align our words with our deeds. I mean, there's nothing more vitriolic to credibility when you have a gap between what you're doing and what you're saying, or you claim to do something, but then you don't do it. So we must make sure that whatever we communicate is actually reflected in what we are doing. And in that respect, I think it's important to underline that we keep the balance right between what NATO is doing on the various sort of core tasks. We need to be mindful that we should not become an alliance which is all about Russia, as we have perhaps been in the past, an alliance all about Afghanistan. So I think it's important to balance collective defense, deterrence with crisis management in Afghanistan, and also partners which we need for addressing these challenges. And then equally important, and goes back to what Janis said about strategic communications, we must make communications an integral part of policy planning. In the past, we all too often had communications as a sort of afterthought. Oh yes, and now give me some robust ideas how I can communicate my policy. Well, this is not the way to do it. You need to embed the thinking about how to communicate at the beginning of a policy planning process. And then also, and I stop it there, it's absolutely crucial to strengthen analytical capabilities and learning mechanisms. So more assessment, more target audience research. We need to get more knowledgeable. I think we have made good progress on the eastern side. We need to get more insights on the western side. So those are some general guidelines, parameters. But then perhaps my last point on a more broader scale, in all the conversations over the last year or so, I have often heard then the commentary that democracies are in a weaker position in comparison to a dictatorial authoritarian regime such as the one run by Mr. Putin. And I think we have to rebut this notion. I think as democracies, we have the stronger system. We have the proof that we can find the better solutions, the smarter solutions to our problems. We are systems which have a much better learning capacity, and as such are the ones who will prevail. So I think what we need collectively, I mean, not only in NATO, but really in, if you wish, in the West, is that we need, I think, more trust and confidence in what we are, what we stand for. And we need also to be honest and brave in tackling the challenges which we have.
All right, thank you very much. I'd just like to, I'm going to come back to you, but I just want to say, I don't know if anyone who backstage is listening, but the computer system here is not working and I can't get any of your messages. So I don't know if somebody can fix that. I think that the Wi-Fi appears to have gone off, or at least here it's not working. This point about getting the message across, I mean, it's all very well to say we need more research, we need to target audiences, but we need to get these messages across. It's like, what's interesting is like, what does that mean in the real world? How are you going to get the message across to sort of Mr. Average or Mrs. Average on the street? Well,
let me give you one example. I mean, when we bring groups to NATO headquarters on a regular basis, we give them a briefing program on the various topics, and at the end of the day, we also ask them to fill in a questionnaire, and that then is a short one. It's one pager. It asks for their feedback on the various briefings on the various topics. But we then also ask the question: in which way has your appreciation or your perception of NATO changed, to the better or to the worse? Yeah. So, and we'll then see the reactions. In many cases, it has improved. Yeah. We even had, I found it particularly gratifying, somebody coming from China whose perception of NATO had improved after a conference. So we have ways of measuring it, but admittedly it's challenging to measure it because clearly behaviors can change over time again, and we need to get better in retaining that type of assessment regularity.
And does it work? Can we measure how it works? I mean, apart from sort of, I know you have groups coming, but in general terms in society, can we measure it, or do we?
Yeah, it also, I mean, it works comparatively easier online. I mean, with social media, where you can monitor, I mean, the number of likes, the sentiments on Facebook and Twitter. So we can watch that. Yeah, but that is a more quantitative approach, if you wish. More challenging from that is a qualitative analysis. Yeah. The example I gave you was one. We also often do, in conjunction with the project partners we are working with, then focus studies or focus interviews with a number of participants to solicit their input and feedback. It's never perfect, yeah? But if we don't build this learning curve into our activities, we're not going to improve. Yeah? So one of my mantras is we have to do it.
Okay. James, share your next 15 years in the British Ministry of Defence and at Oxford University, and now 7 years at Chatham House, and 2 recent publications kind of on this subject, more or less, or overlapping with the subject. The first 2013 book, Hard Diplomacy and Soft Coercion, and a monograph in a Chatham House book earlier this year, Ukraine, A War of Narratives, and arms. Over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Let me talk about what I would say if this were a real talk. First, for 2 reasons, I'm very uncomfortable with the term propaganda. The first of these is that a lot of what we tend to dismiss as propaganda is a view of the world that we don't understand very well and that we are uncomfortable with. And the further removed you are from Russia, the more unfamiliar and uncomfortable this view of the world is, particularly when you're exposed to it in the whole and in the round. And it's very unsettling because people who believe in it, who are one way or another part of various establishments who run Russia, what you hear from them is a perspective on our so-called common problems that has a coherence, integrity, and confidence of its own. And this is very unsettling to a postmodern, an interlocutor from now a postmodern civilization that believes all truths are relative, there are no certainties, everyone is partially to blame, and so on. And it's very easy either to dismiss all this as propaganda or to capitulate to it, because it projects a sense of urgency and purpose. And some of this is vranyo, it's boastful lying. But a lot of it is just what Russia is, and it has to be responded to at the personal and the state level in a considered and strategic way. The second point, though, is that nevertheless, information and disinformation has become one of the primary purposes of the Russian state. And when we are talking about this as a professional activity, again, it's not propaganda. We are talking about information, disinformation, and deception. And disinformation is not about lying. It is about presenting propositions and messages that are both true and false, that are designed to deceive. And what gives Russian disinformation at its best, the power it has, is this amalgam between truth, half-truth, innuendo, non sequiturs, and blatant lies. And that's what's powerful about it. Now, as with all the other issues we are talking about, I come back to the last panel. All of this is most effective when it is exploiting our own vulnerabilities. Not just our own vulnerabilities, but vulnerabilities we have created for ourselves. And one of these, I would say, is intellectual. And it runs across 80% of the media establishment. Take the issue of refugee crisis. On the Russian media, Russian state television, and English, and even more so in Russian, 80% of this discussion is policy discussion. It has its own point of view. There are very strong biases in it. It's very selective. But Western discussion about the same issues, 80% of it is personal interest discussions, screaming babies, interviews with families, impact on people, all the rest of it, and 20% is policy. There's a vacuum there, and it gets exploited. The Russians today, the Russian state, is using history as a tool of political influence in a very aggressive way. Everyone in Latvia knows this. Well, in England, in Britain, very few people in our school system today are educated about their own history. And as a result, you have on one side a coherent view of history that's very well informed but extremely biased and distorted. On the other side, a lack of knowledge. This is another vacuum that exists. And there's another sort of vulnerability, which is where the real targeted element comes in. That what is being done is targeting and reinforcing the prejudices, the anxieties, the resentments of key individuals, groups, and constituencies in various countries. And they change from country to country. Here in Latvia, we know this is mainly targeted against certain constituencies under the broad label of compatriots. In Hungary, it's targeted against a different set of people as it is in France. I'll tell you where the targeting is most effective in the UK. It's with people in political and social prominence, typically people who recently held very high positions in the state, the armed forces. Even at the time when they held these positions, very few of them were dealing directly with Russia. And these are very articulate, very well-spoken people. They're not consciously tools, but they just pick up by osmosis the main lines of the Russian narrative. Even those who totally condemn what Russia has done in Ukraine have picked up the narrative in Britain that Ukraine is a failed state. How could Ukraine be a failed state if after 2 years of all this and 2 major military offensives, the people who Russia is supporting still only control 5% of the country's territory? That's not a failed state to me. The whole narrative that you hear constantly, we made a great mistake. We should have grabbed Russia with both hands in the 1990s. Instead, we punished it and mistreated it and behaved like the victor. Well, I'm sorry if anyone really participated in this exercise. This is almost the opposite of the truth. After the First World War, there's no doubt the West tried to punish Germany, and various things happened as a result. After the Cold War, everything was done in the opposite manner. Nevertheless, we stumbled across an immovable obstacle in the road, which was Russia's determination to resurrect the sphere of interests, and Russia's understanding of equality as a system of equality of great powers at the expense of smaller powers who had to have limited sovereignty. And as this issue became more visible, the problems continued. But these narratives are very powerful in the UK. Fortunately, they have not pollinated into government. My last point, Chairman, is to do with information war. And this comes directly back to the last session. The Ministry of Defense concept of information war in 2011 contained the following paragraph. Forgive me, I should have written it down. I think this is a very accurate paraphrase. That the object is to the use of the information weapon in warfare is to disorientate both the state and society and induce the state to take actions contrary to its own interests that advance the aims of the opponent. This is official Russian military policy. I don't have time here to cite examples out of the Ukraine conflict where I think this has happened very successfully. Suffice to say, at this moment, the January 2015 military offensive that preceded the Minsk Accords was not simply an offensive in war fighting, it was an offensive in information war. It had the desired result in that it created a sense of urgency, even panic, in Berlin and Paris, and produced, without any warning, a visit, a descent on Kiev, on Poroshenko, and a set of agreements that I think at many levels are very injudicious and disadvantageous, not only to Ukraine's interests, but Western interests. The real danger arises when disinformation spreads from the public realm, the intellectual realm, into the government realm and starts to contaminate government decision-making. And I think this is where NATO comes in, this is where your center comes in. That danger is certainly present. So I'll stop there.
Well, actually, we do have more time because...
it's a good place to stop, to draw breath. The fact that we have more time means that when we have questions, we might be able to,
Well, let's start with questions. Let's in fact start with some questions then. We've got time, so who would like to kick off? Please don't forget, gentleman over there, please don't forget to say who you are. Number one, let's take three. 1, 2, anybody else? No? Okay, we've got 2 to start with. So please just remind us, tell us who you are.
Thanks very much. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies in Brussels. And my first point is, as much as the Kremlin's approach to Infowar is top-down, vertical, from the Kremlin to the TV channels to the last troll in the St. Petersburg troll factory, our response cannot replicate this, but must exactly be the contrary. It must be bottom-up. So it has to come from civil society. I mean, just like resilience and actually ultimately the defense of our societies, the info war, the answer to info war stands and falls with the citizens. So that means foundations, think tanks, networks of people, political parties, and I do very much value and respect what Gerlinde and Yannis are doing, but the accent should actually be on civil society in our answer. And my second point is, let's not forget about entertainment. I mean, the Wilfried Martens Center, after an event last Monday, was called by a troll, Belgijski Centr antirossijskoj propagande. Our answer to this was, we find that a highly unfair accusation. We're not Belgian, we're European. That's the style.
Okay, I mean, that sounds like a comment, but is there a question specifically? Or perhaps we could just say, okay, well, is it feasible? I mean, civil society. Okay, sorry, there was you and then the lady over there.
Vasyl Moroznichenko, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, an organization which was set up in March of last year. The primary purpose of the organization was to amplify Ukraine's voice internationally, work B2B, works with journalists. We now have a database of 10,000 journalists, international journalists interested in Ukraine, who get our updates on a daily and weekly basis. We also provide trainings to the government of Ukraine, to various departments, straightening up their communications capabilities. So I have a specific question to the panel with respect to the unit which was created by the EU to deal with the Russian disinformation. I wonder how much of communication and cooperation there is between NATO and EU and maybe other individual governments with respect to dealing with this issue. Thank you.
Okay, specific question, and the lady just there.
Yes, Elina Langi from NATO's Stratcom Center of Excellence. We heard a lot about Russia in the context of propaganda war, but what about Daesh, or the so-called Islamic State? What would the panel say? How do you characterize their propaganda war, and how do you feel it is something new and something different from what we've seen before from terrorist organizations? Thank you.
Great, okay. Fine. Well, who would like to sort of to pick up on that? I mean, we've got those 3 questions: cooperation with the EU, civil society, and Islamic State. I mean, when it comes to Islamic State, I do wonder sometimes whether we've been sleepwalking into this problem for, well, ever since 9/11, really. Because if you consider that huge numbers of huge percentages of people in Arab countries and Muslim countries believe that 9/11 was some form of inside job. We didn't appear to be that worried about it. Now we're worried about disinformation because perhaps it's, well, I don't know, not closer to home, but for some reason we're now worried about disinformation because it's closer to your home, but not to Europe in general. But anyway, I'm just throwing that out. So please.
Yeah, well, first on the civil society, I think yes, that's actually, if we look at the strengths of us as collective Europe or collective West, that's our sort of civic society strengths. But one point is actually you have to recognize that you are at information war to get civil society moving. And actually the element of having information war is to do it in a way you don't recognize it. So in a way there's a problem in there, is that if you don't awaken the civil society to the issue, you might actually miss it. And by the time when you have really it in your face, it might be too late. But I would certainly agree with you that that is a powerful tool that certainly Russia does not possess. But of course, if we wake the civil society too late, it might be too late. So, and the other point on that is one thing that I would remind everybody, that within the Gerasimov's doctrine, according to which, in my view, they conducted the Crimean operation, etc., you can say that they believe they're at constant information war with us. So it is not something that goes up and down.
Yes.
It's a constant element, and we sort of tend to forget or neglect it. So civil society has to do it all the time. On EU, yes, we do have a cooperation. Of course, we and them are new, so there's still a lot of room for improvement. The difference probably is they're more about operation. We are more about establishing what happens in a sort of more research mode and looking at the methodology development based on that knowledge. The last piece on Daesh, thank you for asking. I think, in fact, there's one thing that you can say is, if I look at what happens in the information space, I think Russians are putting a lot of resources into it. They're having all the state capacities putting into, sustaining this information environment influence campaign, but they are not innovative, they're not adaptive, and you always see they pay for the service. If I look at the Daesh, I think they don't have so much resources, but the way I would, based on the way we researched what they're doing, is big part of their relative success with other terrorist organizations is actually how good they are at information space environment, how good they are at social networks. You can come close to saying that the backbone of ISIS coordination is Twitter. If there wouldn't be a Twitter, you might not have the success of ISIS. And if I look, they are agile, they're innovative, they have network synergies. And that is a different phenomenon that I think is more pointing to what future holds for us, rather than Russia, where Russia is basically looking at what has been existent, taking it in their sort of inventory, of course putting their philosophy on it, and then employing it.
But how is ISIL innovative?
I think
what's different?
Well, in a way they recruit people. How they use the social media, actually our social media, and are resilient. And we've seen parties are trying to take them down, and they'll thrive there. They circulate their information. They're effective at addressing, and you could see specifically the age groups they're targeting. And they don't necessarily need physically be in place. They can do it over the distances. The benefit of social media, the benefit of internet. Russians have not gone into that to the same extent. Of course they have troll farms, of course they're circulating a lot of material, but not in that interactive element that the ISIS is doing.
James, looks like you...
Some of these questions, particularly about Daesh, go outside my area of knowledge. But on the margins, the 2 points that have come up that I think need some amplification. Tim, you mentioned you know, this extraordinary lie about 9/11. I'm less concerned about this because when there is a specific point of disinformation about a specific event, probably the most ominous of this kind was over MH17 recently. Usually within a fairly swift period of time, you can expose the lie. What concerns me, and what I think properly concerns you and NATO, is strategic disinformation. Information which is designed to alter our general view of what is going on, why it is going on. If you are starting with the view that Russia is reasonably reasserting itself against a Western world that tried to humiliate it after 1991, and is only doing what any other great state would do in similar circumstances, and you haven't thought about this and you haven't considered it, you don't have a set of considered answers, then, my God, you're in trouble. Now, I don't normally mention names, but when it comes to a public figure, I'll mention a name. When Madame Mogherini first took up her post, her first comment on Ukraine was the following. She said, we have to understand there are many different narratives about this crisis and they all have to be treated with respect. And my response was, good God, madam, are you chairing an academic seminar or making policy for the European Union? Because what she says is being heard by everyone. If she says that, what hope do you have that there are going to be key elements of civil society who understand, have a clear alternative view to the Russian view about what all of this is about? Julian Lindley-French was absolutely right in the last panel. The key vulnerability here, and the key responsibility, does not lie with society, it lies with our elites. And one of the biggest and most unfavorable contrasts with the Cold War is that we have virtually no one in position of authority in the West who does what de Gaulle did, what Adenauer did, what Harry Truman did, which is explain to people why we have this problem, what it is about, why our interests are engaged, why it is necessary to make sacrifices. There is no leadership of this kind, but you get this leadership from Russia, and it fills all these vacuums.
So often I've heard in Ukraine and other places, the reason that we like this man is because he's a leader. It doesn't matter almost what he stands for, but he's a
I mean, the biggest, the Russians clearly, Putin's Russia knows its interests and pursues them. And a lot of people say, oh my God, then we have to live with this, we have to accommodate it. No, isn't it time that we, the Western world, understand our interests and approach them with some confidence, and said with some confidence, Europe is immeasurably better today, a finer place than it has been at any time in the past, because NATO and the EU extend all the way up to the Russian border. Why are we not capable of articulating that case in a confident way?
But you've asked the question, but now, can you answer it? Why? Is the answer because we don't have proper leadership or strong leadership?
I think, yes, and then you have to ask a different question we don't have time to get into, which, why don't we have it?
Okay, fine, all right. Okay, but do you want to come in here?
Well, yes, in a way, it's also the answer I wanted to give to Roland, because in many ways, I think it is really both. It is the bottom-up sort of nurturing the civil society, which is the backbone for also for good governance, if you wish, and for societies being resilient against information warfare or propaganda. So definitely we need that, and we do a lot of that. I think we have sterling cases to show how important a vibrant civil society is, and in many ways I think Ukraine is a case in point, because it's the Ukraine Crisis Media Center for that matter, because I mean you are formally speaking an NGO, but you have done an enormous contribution to sort of reforming your country on the media landscape. So I think the civil society has a key role to play. but so has political leadership. And if we don't have political leaders, male or female, who are courageous enough to stand up for our values and our principles, and to have also the strategic patience to explain to everybody why this is required, then we are lacking something. Yeah. So political leadership, in my mind, goes hand in hand with a strong civil society. And then that was the point I tried to make earlier. I think the model we have, the democratic model, with all the deficits which we know, is simply the better model. So I think we can be proud of that achievement, and we should be saying so. There's nothing wrong with that. On the NATO-EU front, yes, in many ways, it might be ironic to say, but in many ways, Mr. Putin has given us a favor there, because the NATO-EU cooperation has intensified because of that, notably in the area of hybrid warfare. So a lot of cooperation and discussion goes on there. In many ways, what is happening, we are developing our policies not formally speaking in tandem, but in terms of substance in tandem, so that they are properly interlinked. Also because from the NATO side, there's only a partial answer to hybrid warfare within our toolbox. A number of aspects pertaining to hybrid warfare, energy security, information security, cyber security, would come more from the EU angle. So hybrid warfare, if you wish, has been a useful motor there. And it is also the motor which brings our cooperation in strategic communications closer. So we do have contacts and cooperation with the EU's East Stratcom team. We are looking into cooperating in areas where we can do some, let's call it, pooling and sharing. Analysis, for example, is an area there. Opinion polling could be another one. Sharing of information, which is valuable for all of us. So the cooperation is being intensified in that respect. And then back on the Russia front, I think we also should be fairly confident in the respect that Russia, with all the money it puts into its information campaign, is ultimately not that outstandingly successful. I mean, if I remember a recent poll which was conducted by, I think it was Pew, Russia is popular in, I think, something like 3 countries. I mean, Ghana, Vietnam, and something else. So, and President Putin is even less popular. So in that sense, I mean, in spite of all the money they throw at this, their recognition and their standing is really deteriorating. And something similar probably can be said about RT, former Russia Today. I mean, the viewership they claim is a myth. I mean, RT is a disinformation campaign in its own right. Yeah, they claim to have millions of viewers, but they never prove that. Yeah, so also that, I think, is a reason to put more trust in ourselves, because we are comparatively doing a good job.
All right, now we've got some questions which I've been given on pieces of paper because the system's not working. The 2 I don't know, I don't know who they came from. One, it says, resilience of society is important, but mid-long-term solution for informational influence. Aren't there any short-term patches? I don't know if somebody wants to pick that up. Somebody else has commented, the Russian state is using history as a political tool as a means to achieve their goals. What is their goal? And the one I do know who it comes from, because I've got it printed here from Mark Gagliotti, says, what is Russia's goal? But then his answer is, they want to say, you cannot ignore us. I'm going to throw those out. I don't know if you want to comment on all of those.
Well, on the Russian goals, I think I would pick on that. I think if you boil it down to the essential, the Russian goal is to keep the stability of the regime. That's their goal. From there on, they come, what are the most likely venues for success? And I think from there you come to this notion that now that they don't have the economic growth, you don't have the capacity to redistribute wealth, both to the elite as well as to the society, you have to come up with something else instead of it. And this idea is that has happened. been very successful in uniting the society is external threat, greatness of Russia, Russia being different. The other point I think also that explains their particular focus on targeting our value system, because I think if you look at all the narratives and methods, they're actually at the core of it targeting whatever are the Western values. Why? Because I think they're afraid of these values once again, as it was in the 80s, undermining the social, the peace as they've created in their country, and therefore that's an effort. And from there you need to have this element of great Russia, respected Russia, Putin the most powerful leader, because it sort of brings into their narrative that we are great, we are successful, everybody are attacking us because we're so good, but the basics is, it's not because to have a great Russia, I would agree with the session this morning, and they're actually very rational on these things. It is about actually keeping the country together in the way they have made it to their liking, and actually keeping the elite in place and stable. That's the core of their interest.
Great. Okay, please, James.
One big point of agreement with Yanis, and if I may, one small point of disagreement. Yes, I think the fundamental ultimate interest in Russia is to create an external environment conducive to the maintenance and prolongation of this system of governance at home. Okay, we can agree upon this. And part of this means doing anything, helping along any developments, tendencies, processes that damage the liberal democratic model. And again, they're most effective at doing this, or we have damaged ourselves. I mean, there are genuine crises, problems, deficiencies that have been exploited since the financial crisis began in 2008. There's Greece on top of it, refugees, so on. Where I disagree is that, Russia, like any state, quite legitimately, has its own geopolitical interests, and they're not all explicable in terms of what's going on at home. The Syria adventure is not very popular at home. It's a constraint. Now, of course, the geopolitical interest in Syria is also tied up with preventing the West from gaining from what is happening there. So these things do interconnect. And because Russia has geopolitical interests which are very reasonable from the standpoint of Moscow, doesn't necessarily mean that they're interests that we have to accept. The additional reinforcement of the refugee crisis for the whole region is value added for the Russians. It's certainly damaging one core Western interest, which is to maintain the integrity of Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey. It's affecting Europe. So their interests, again, even when they are purely geopolitical, are not necessarily the same as ours. But we need to be able, when we discuss these things, to articulate interests of our own. And on the Syria issue, what is striking is the West has just had a narrative. It's not had a policy for 4 years. And it's created almost an invitation for the Russians to come in and define themselves as the determinant actor in this region. And many of our long-standing allies in the region are beginning to draw conclusions from this. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you very much. Gentleman there, you were definitely first. Good. We're going to do three at a time, and then number two, the lady there, and then lady in the red jacket there, and then I'm going to come to you for the next lot. So here, this gentleman.
Hello, Ayars Kalniņš. I'm chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Latvian Parliament. It's been said that you can't banish lies, you can only defeat them. And I would agree, I'm against censorship, but I am for education. And when we talk about the publics that are exposed to disinformation, in the past we've talked about the Russian public, the Ukrainian public, the Eastern Europeans. But there's Western Europe, there's the United States, there's Canada, that really needs to be educated into the source of where their information is coming from. And whether it's RT or Sputnik or think tanks that are covers for Russian sponsored organizations, a lot of this information is going out. And would you agree that more needs to be done to educate the Western public on where these arguments and information is coming from? And in here I would say that it's not just a case of the narrative in Ukraine or Greater Russia, but it's issues like TTIP. There may be legitimate arguments in Europe against TTIP, but there's no question that Russia is very interested in supporting every anti-TTIP argument that exists. Earlier today we heard about political parties in Europe that are getting Russian funding. And I would say when we talk about the goals of Russia, one way that Russia feels that it becomes stronger is if the EU is weaker and if the US is diminished in power. And the way to do this is to feed into all the anti-EU, anti-US forces through the media, through think tanks. And the last point, I think it's in the US they have laws about the exposure, let's say lobbyists have to expose what governments they work for. It's a foreign agent law. I don't know how much this applies in in Europe, but would you think that in terms of media or internet media coverage, where more should be done to expose who is providing this information, who is funding these web pages, where is this information coming from? Not to stop it, but just to help our people understand where they're getting this info from.
Thank you. I think you were next. Sorry, oh no, it was you, sorry. Yeah, sorry, you're, okay.
Thank you. Yes, I have a related question about NATO member states, so the audiences. So I'm Nora Vanaga from National Defense Academy Latvia, and my question would go to Dr. Niehaus, as she has been former working at the NATO Public Division, so you have experience in this regard, and of course to Mr. Sarts, who is the head of the Stratcom COE. So how are your views on how successful is NATO on communicating with its own audience about NATO commitment to its member states in case of crisis? The Pew survey published this early summer clearly shows that publics of all NATO member states, except UK, do not support involvement of their armies in case of crisis would happen in Baltic states, as US would take care anyway. Thank you.
All right. I think it was you, the third question. The next, yeah?
I'm not sure I have a question so much as an expression of discomfort, because I do believe that Russia is engaging in a propaganda war, and I do think that something needs to be done. But
just tell us who you are.
Oh, sorry. Dr. Maxine David, British, but working at Leiden University. So I'm having trouble as a Brit who's waiting for the Chilcot report into the truth of Iraq to come out. I'm having trouble as a Brit exposed to the British media talking the truth about the European Union. And I'm having trouble as a European who's been watching the lack of a coherent response in Europe to the refugee crisis, indeed to some very abhorrent governmental responses to that crisis. So I'm worried about these notions of truth and European identity and values that we're bandying around. And I'm wondering if we really need to return to Mark Galeotti's point earlier today about hypocrisy and really avoiding any semblance of it.
Okay, fine. Who wants to, well, first of all, there was the question from the gentleman there. Who would like to pick up on that, about educating Western publics?
I just respond to a question with a question. Is anyone trying to control debate about Iraq in the UK? Could you, I would be at this point puzzled to name any prominent figure, any academic, politician who is willing to sit in front of a group like this and defend the UK's policy in Iraq. I think there are very few such people. If anyone feels intimidated, I think these people are more likely to feel intimidated than the questioner. I don't see any lack of debate or discussion about the refugee crisis. What I do see, and it comes back to the first point I made, is a lack of intellectuality and seriousness in the quality of our media discussion. But this is not because of bias. This is because of, other factors that unfortunately are part of the way our society works now or does not work properly.
Okay. Who else wants to, please?
Well, thank you for the OER's question, a part of it. Can we do more in this online space? I think there's a tricky situation for us as a West, because we've basically been always advocating for deregulated internet. And the countries like Russia and China have been saying, we want to go for the regulation. And now what? I think, therefore, it's not about regulation within that space, it's about empowering groups to actually expose what is happening. Because if you think it through, by starting the regulation of internet, it leads in the places we don't want to go. But actually empowering people to actually seek out in this what is happening and putting into the plain sight is something we can actually do. On the other question on NATO and perceptions of whether people would go to help or not, I think first, there's as far as you can go to rely on opinion polls. If you would put your money relying on the opinion polls on the elections in UK or on Canada, you would lose all of your money. So they're really unreliable. So that is not the good source of understanding where the society is thinking. And therefore, I would say, in a given circumstances, they might actually change their attitudes. But of course, the other piece of it is, if you would ask Latvian society about refugees, it would have the, we don't care about their problems, they're not that much caring about our problems. And that's about actually going back to the point, to the leadership trying to explain it. And it takes, in a society, you have to have leaders that lead the way. If you always sort of sound out what the society is thinking, you will not reach the successful policies as you could have. And that's, I think, about, once again, back to the, what do we constitute as Europe and the West, whether we stand for each other. I would claim, and I think now, with all the support this region gets from NATO countries in the military terms and others, when really problems come, we come together. The problem is, and that's a problem with information warfare, is in the times when we don't sense there is a problem, we're really oblivious. And if you, through the information warfare, you can further your interest in a given social group without them noticing, you're actually driving the split more and more. And of course, I would agree with the point that Russia feels itself more powerful, at least the more disunited Europe is, least US is involved in the European affairs. That is one point of their policy.
On the question about audiences in NATO nations on our home front, clearly, I mean, this is, I think, the first and foremost target audience we need to be aware of, because at the end of the day, the support to NATO depends on having support from the 28 democratic nations setting up the alliance. So, and if that public support is not any longer there, then we have an existential problem. So nurturing that support understanding is absolutely vital. And that's also where we put our emphasis. Now, having said that, as an intergovernmental organization, in the setup of NATO, the first responsibility for that resides with the nations themselves. What we do from headquarters is, at least in the general philosophy, complementary to what nations are doing. But collectively, I think what we need to make much clearer than we have been doing in the past years is the value of security and peace in many ways. It does not come for granted. I mean, you have to invest in defense in order to have a life in peace. Yeah, and this notion that we have been living in Europe in some form of complacency is probably something we can't afford any longer. But we need to have also governments speaking up in that respect and make clear to their populations that peace and security don't come for free, and investment in defense matters. Otherwise, we don't have the defense and deterrence we need. And then you're right. I mean, when we look at the perceptions in NATO nations, what we normally see is that NATO's image is relatively good wherever you go. I mean, data vary. I mean, it's between 70, sometimes 80% that the image is good. But what we also see is that there is still a lack of understanding what we're actually doing. So more needs to be done in order to explain the contributions. So it's not nothing where we can tick the box. And then on the media front, that's probably something which is first and foremost for the media themselves. I would argue to think between them whether they need some form of, I don't know, I mean, some form of code of conduct where they become more aware of also a better way of dealing with propaganda, to be less subjective, whether there are laws which could be agreed or enhanced in the realm of the European Union, which would strengthen media freedom. What we are doing is we try to give media access to information so that they can report as well as possible with original data. But clearly it's not our job to regulate media. I mean, we want to have media which are professional and capable, and with our means we are contributing to that.
I'm just going to picture slightly. There's a Twitter just there which says that it's from Hans de Vrel, and it says, you're talking about Twitter, but you don't tweet. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, why is that? If Twitter is so important, and I did notice, I did start to follow your centre, and did discover that it had only a couple of thousand followers, if that. I was quite surprised about that. Is there a reason for that?
Well, I think the point about strategic communication is there's so many actual entities within NATO that do their communication. Mm-hmm. Our major effort is actually to do the thinking and development of methodologies, not to add another voice to this sort of messaging.
Fine, you should tweet that. That's good. Okay. Fine. Okay. Now, hang on. There were two over there first. Sorry, two over there. Gentleman there and over there. Okay. And then we've got a room. Yeah, one, and then. Oh, great. Okay. Well, let's go ahead.
Thank you very much. Martin Michlo from the European Institute for European Policy in Prague. I just had a couple questions about the presentations that we had. We talked about ISIS, we talked about Russia, and we basically concluded that the groups or these countries are tapping into our weaknesses. So my question is, I mean, should the goal of or should our objective not be addressing our weaknesses at home, which is to say addressing the causes that lead information warfare by Russia or by the ISIS group to be effective? And I very often hear, criticism of NATO, criticism of the EU not doing enough. And there was a very strong call by Mr. Scher saying that, we don't communicate what we do well. So, I think my question is, why are we not talking about addressing our weaknesses, and why are our leaders criticizing the EU when as a matter of fact, the EU tends to be nothing much more than what we actually decide to put into it. So I'm very surprised about this criticism, and I'd be happy if you could just tell me a bit more about what our objectives are. As a matter of fact, a simple question.
Great, yes, that's a very simple question. Good.
Thank you, Tim. Marissa Lutsevich, Chatham House. I would like to come back to a discussion about narrative, because from our perspective here in the West, we quite well decipher and explain what is Russian narrative. I was in the room of senior advisors panel at Chatham House, and one of the ladies asked me, what is our narrative? So I would like you to use me as a dummy and to try to tell me what is our narrative. And I am a European citizen. What is our narrative? I think it's very important. And my second question is about Ukraine. Tim knows, who visited the occupied territories, that the population got radicalized, and Russia was able to do what it was able to do because it had information cohesion and prevalence, explaining how evil and bad Kiev is and how everybody will be exterminated when this new government takes office. So the first thing that separatists did, took over TV towers, plugged in Russian channels, created separatist channels, and now what is called liberated territories are still being transmitted this message, and Kiev is not having a strong strategy. So my question is to NATO, what NATO is doing to reinforce Ukraine, as one of the partner nations, information security, and how do you assess the strategy of Ukrainian government? They've taken a few steps to reinforce information security.
Okay. Did I already select somebody? No? Oh, yes, sorry, please.
In trouble, thank you. Eric Rasmussen, I'm a medical doctor with the U.S. Office of Naval Research, and I work mostly with humanitarian support. I lead teams into areas that sometimes, because of local narratives, have become issues of force protection for the teams that I lead. There is a Russian source, Russia Today, that was mentioned just a little while ago, RT. I just received word that the founder of RT, Mikhail Lesin, has just been found dead in Washington, D.C., which may have some ramifications. For all I know, it's completely benign, but it stimulated the question, when Russia has some voice that it chooses to suppress, should NATO or the Office of Strategic Communication do something about that in a visible way?
Okay. Okay, we'll go from one.
No, I think you should.
I start. Okay.
No, you must start. Yes.
I must start. Good. I shall
really
start.
Mainly at you, yes.
Yeah. In those two questions about objectives and narrative, I think I can be very, very short. It's encapsulated in the following. From the NATO side, peace and security, that's our mission. As simple as that. And from there, you can develop a narrative. But clearly, at the end, it needs to be a statement. Yeah? And I think that's what it embodies. On the question about the Ukraine information security, I think there are two strands of work. One is under the trust funds which we have created. There's a trust fund. I think it's led by Romania, if my memory serves me right, which is trying to or seeks to help Ukraine improve its cybersecurity. So that's one aspect. Related to that is another trust fund which enhances Ukraine's capability in communication and command, which is the communication infrastructure you need on the military side to have safe communication and secure communication networks. So that's more, if you wish, on the military side of the cooperation. On the civilian side of the cooperation, which is sort of our side, we have recently agreed. Actually, it was the Secretary General, NATO Secretary General, signing together with the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council in Ukraine, what we call a strategic communication partnership roadmap between the NATO International Secretariat and the NSDC in Ukraine. And that roadmap is, if you wish, a framework which allows us to work with Ukraine in order to improve its communication efforts on the governmental side. So we have comments on that process together with the Ukrainian colleagues and friends. But clearly, that is a long-term undertaking, yeah, because the situation in Ukraine, people in the room probably know this better than I do, is complex. The structure is not always coherent and consistent. So we try to help them go through the path of making their system work better and become more effective for their own future.
Great. Yes, please.
I will divide the audience now, or maybe just turn them all against myself. My answer to the last question is no, we should not be doing anything about this, or commenting at an official level. I think our position today with Russia would be far stronger and far clearer had we said at the beginning, Russia's internal affairs are Russia's business. Ukraine's internal affairs are not Russia's business. Latvia's internal affairs are not Russia's business. This does not mean, of course, it's not the business of Western NGOs, it's not the business of society, it's not the business of all sorts of groups. I think at an official level, we have weakened our own position in dealing with the Russians by giving vent to something that does exist, which is a kind of evangelical streak in our own nature, which does at times take the form of democracy promotion. And here I come back to Arisia's question. Our objective, in my view, should be to defend liberal democratic states and the institutions of liberal democracy, where they have roots, where they exist, where they reflect the values and culture of people, and that means Europe. It's quite another matter to try to do the same in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, and someplace else. Because if you get outside this domain, what matters more than what we like to call values are identities, and a lot of identities and other cultures feel very threatened by this. And Russia is in a somewhat in-between position, and I think we have to be much more realistic about the kind of world and the plurality of cultural traditions and sentiments about identity that exist in it.
Okay, there was a question from Prague as well. Would somebody like to address that? Addressing our weaknesses, our own weaknesses, please.
Well, I think that the point is the democracy is not perfect. And it relies on some of the processes that sometimes are rather difficult consultation processes between different political players trying to agree on common sort of policy, trying to take the public opinion with you, which is a strong element of trying to be successful in domestic policies. These are, if you look from if you want to create an information operation against that kind of country or society, these are immediate sort of potential targets that you target, especially if you do that on the back of on the issue that is burning within the given society or social group. So, can you fix it all? I don't think. There'll always be cases, inroads for somebody who is interested to attack you, the venues. And if you look at how Russia has taken up Baltics, some of the Nordic countries, or UK, all different kinds of sorts of approaches they've been using, but they always define what's the weakness points, what the points they will put stress on, they'll achieve the effect. So fixing each single weakness, I don't think is neither effective nor necessary, because it is part of the process.
Part of our system.
Yeah, part of our system, and that's one of the part of the values that you can speak out with your opinion. But the point is actually A, awareness, B, having your own strategic narrative, competency of those that are disseminating information, journalists namely, of actually look through what is probably the first visible, but actually seeing the context within which the information has been given to them, and educating the society per se. I am of the opinion, not only because of the information war, but in the way that society changes, the amount of information that we are fed with, we have to get a better information literacy from the school to able to understand yourself, to orientate within a given context and society. And these are the remedies, because there are always going to be weaknesses. You can't fix them all. So it's about resilience more than fixing weaknesses, as far as I would be concerned. On your question, should we do something? I don't think, once again, I've been picked up by my point on another voice. That's true, I'm speaking here and I'm having a voice. But the point is, not probably specifically for COE or for NATO as such, but for the opinion leaders to pick on this is something that we should actually show to our public what is happening, and also to remind, as much as it will resonate to the Russian public, that this is what happens. This is what happens. And in fact, sometimes we say things, but they don't resonate with the Russian public, and etc. But I think over the time, it is important to create certain baselines that we could refer to. And we're sort of, it's worthless effort, we won't do that. It is, in my view, important. Because what I think Russian strengths have been, they've been strong at tactical level, in the current moment, current situation. But in fact, their strategy has inherent weakness. That's in a longer term. Because their value system, in my view, is flawed. The lying, and we have a Russian proverb, lie has a short legs. So over the time, you will face the issue of credibility, and you would not have benefit of doubt. So they are successful in the early stage of this engagement in the information space. But over a longer period of time, if we are clever, we will go back to them at this credibility and losing this credibility. And if we've been good establishing baselines, being credible with what we say, we will have credibility, and they will not. And if I could say a short comment in the way I see the information space on Syria, I think we've seen the first signs of it. That they have lost the credibility, they have not been given benefit of doubt on the way they presented why they're in Syria and what they do there.
Thank you very much. I know that unfortunately there were some more questions, but I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I've been told in no uncertain terms that we've run out of time. You can't see the puppet masters behind me. So I'm sorry about that, but I'm sure that if there are any questions you can talk to, we've got coffee now, and we'll have another panel in half an hour, the future of the European order. But I would like to say, ask everyone to give a big thanks to our panelists. It was a long session, but very rich and deep one. Thank you very much.